Hello, everybody. During the series of these 5 lectures, we will discuss the topic of cell injury, cell death, and adaptations, which belongs to Chapter 2 in your Robbins and Catran Basic Pathology book. So our body, as you all know, is made of the basic unit, which is called the cell. These cells are composed of different parts or components. As you all know from your histology courses, the cell is covered by a cell membrane that you can see here, made up of bilayer of phospholipids and proteins, etc. It also contains a nucleus inside, covered with a nuclear membrane. Also, it contains many organelles, the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria, which is the energy factory of the cell, many ribosomes producing proteins, lysosomes containing digestive enzymes, in addition to other components. Now, these cells, they interact actively with their surrounding environment. So they are constantly changing. They change in order to adjust their structure and their function in order to adapt to changing demands and stresses that surrounds each cell. Now, the intracellular compartment of each cell is kept within a normal range, and it is highly regulated, so it remains constant. This is what we call homeostasis. So every cell lives in its own homeostasis اللي بتحاول إنها تحافظ عليه. Now, when a cell encounters any increasing demands, or like physiologic stresses, for example, or is exposed to any injurious stimuli, these cells will change, will undergo changes. The changes can be either adaptation, تأقلم مع البيئة الجديدة أو مع الوضع الجديد. However, these adaptive capabilities are restricted. So when the adaptive capability of the cell is exceeded, then the cell is transformed or is involved in a process called cell injury. And even this cell injury can be at the first reversible injury, but if the stresses or the injurious stimuli are very severe or constant, progressive, or very rapid, the cell will enter into irreversible cell injury, or what we call it cell death. Why we call it irreversible? Because it's the point of no return. The cell cannot go back to normal. While in the reversible injury, the cell can go back to normal when the injury abates or disappears. So why we study cell injury? Because cell injury is the crucial and the basic event in any disease process. So all diseases of the body will start at first by cell injury. So we have to study cell injury and know about the reaction of the cell to its surrounding environment, whether by first adaptation, second by reversible cell injury, and third by irreversible cell injury, or what we call it death. So again, as a repeat to what I have said in the previous slide, every normal cell lives in a homeostasis in which its intracellular compartment is kept within a normal or a restricted range and highly regulated. If this cell is exposed to any stress, physiologic stress, or a mild injurious stimulus, the first response of the cell is to do adaptation. زي الإنسان لما يتعرض ل أي stress في حياته، أول إشي بيعمله إنه بيحاول to adapt. It's the same applies here. So first, the cell will try to adapt. However, if the adaptive capability of the cell is exceeded, or if the injurious stimulus is severe, the cell will go into cell injury. Now, the cell injury can be subdivided into two types: reversible injury, in which if the injurious stimulus is relieved or removed, the cell will go back to normal. While if the injurious stimulus is very severe and progressive or very rapid, the cell will enter into irreversible cell injury. From its name, it's the point of no return. The cell cannot go back to normal, even if the injurious stimulus abates. And irreversible injury is the synonym or the similar meaning to cell death. So irreversible injury equals cell death, which can be done or can be reached by two ways. The first one is called necrosis, and the second one is called apoptosis. Now, in your book, in Robbins starts with the cell injury and the causes of cell injury, mechanisms of cell injury, and the necrosis and then apoptosis, and it ends with the discussion of adaptations. We will discuss all of these topics during our lectures. However, I will start with adaptations because in a logic way, when the cell is exposed to stress or injurious stimulus, the first thing to be done is adaptation before it go into cell injury. So adaptations are subdivided into physiologic adaptations, which is a physiologic phenomenon that can be done or that can be a response to any physiologic changes in our body, and pathologic adaptations, which can result in a disease or that can result from a disease process. Now, adaptations can take many forms. It can result in increase in cell size, حجم الخلية بيزيد, or increase in the number of cells, عدد الخلايا بيزيد, or a decrease in the number of cells, عدد الخلايا بيقل, أو حجم let's say حجم الخلايا بيقل, and a change from one type of cell to another type. These all forms of adaptations in which the cell is still alive, الخلية بعدها عايشة, and still functional. However, the function can be changed according to the change in cell size or cell number or the change in the type of cell. The functions can be affected, can be different from the functions of the normal cell. However, the cell is still functional with different capabilities and still alive. So we have four adaptive mechanisms, and these adaptive mechanisms are the hypertrophy, hyperplasia, atrophy, and metaplasia. So all of these adaptive mechanisms are considered reversible. That is, when the stressful event is relieved, the cell will go back to normal. Now let's start with hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is defined as increase in the cell size and functional capacity, because when you increase the cell size, the function of the cell will increase. So the net result is increase in the organ size. Hypertrophy can be pure in organs or in cells that have a limited capacity to divide, so they cannot go hyperplasia. They only undergo hypertrophy. But also it can be mixed in cells or in tissues that have the ability to divide. So if we are talking about, for example, the skeletal muscles or the cardiac muscles, the striated muscles, they can only undergo hypertrophy. But when we are talking about, for example, the smooth muscles of the uterus, these can they have an ability to divide, so they can undergo hypertrophy and hyperplasia if they are subjected to stress or increased demand. The mechanism of hypertrophy is by increased production of structural proteins and organelles. And also hypertrophy can be pathologic and can be physiologic. The Causes of hypertrophy are subdivided into hormonal stimulation, growth factor stimulation, or increased functional demand. For example, the best example or the most common example on pathologic hypertrophy is the hypertrophy of the cardiac muscles as a response to hypertension ارتفاع ضغط الدم or aortic valve stenosis الناس اللي بيكون عندهم تضيق في ال aortic valve. So this is the normal heart here. You can look to the thickness of the myocardium of the left ventricle and compare it with the heart with cardiac hypertrophy. Here, look at the thickness of the muscles of the left ventricle. This patient will have either hypertension or aortic valve stenosis. When the demand increases on the heart due to the stenosis or due to the hypertension, the cardiac muscle cells will start to adapt to increase the force of contraction, and the only way is by increasing its size by hypertrophy because they cannot increase the number of cells here. So the net result is an increase in the size of the heart. Now, the heart has a capacity to this adaptation. So this adaptation, if it reaches a limit, then the cardiac muscles will undergo cell injury. It's not very well understood why after a while of cardiac hypertrophy the heart will enter into cell injury, but one of the mechanisms may be by the hypertrophied muscles or the thickened heart will need more blood supply, which cannot be sustained, so the cells will start to degenerate and the cell injury will take place. Those patients, after a while, they will live with heart failure, for example. So the mechanism here is by increasing functional demand. Now or أحيانا بيكون برضه growth factor stimulation. Now, hormonal stimulation also, like in the uterus of a patient who is pregnant, the smooth muscles of the uterus can undergo hypertrophy and hyperplasia in response to the estrogenic stimulation during pregnancy. So this is a physiologic adaptive mechanism. Also, if you are talking about the skeletal muscles of an athlete, for example, bodybuilders, the skeletal muscles will adapt due to this increased demand by hypertrophy. That's why you will find the muscles of the bodybuilders and the athletes are enlarged. So these are examples in physiologic and pathologic hypertrophy. So this picture here illustrates to you the pathologic cardiac muscle hypertrophy in patients with hypertension and aortic stenosis. Look at the normal myocyte here, or the normal structure of the heart, and when it is exposed to a stress and increased workload like in hypertension or aortic stenosis, the heart muscle will enlarge in size, what we call it hypertrophy, and the whole heart will enlarge in size. فهدول المرضى بيكون عندهم تضخم في القلب ومع الوقت ممكن يتحول إلى heart failure. ففي البداية بيكون adaptation، لكن I said الadaptation له limit، بعد هيك راح يصير فيه cell injury. لما يصير فيه cell injury الخلايا بصير فيها cell death like in the cases of, for example of ischemia and myocardial infarction. Again, here this is the example on physiologic hypertrophy. Again, the uterine smooth muscle cells, smooth muscle in pregnancy. This is the uterus in pregnancy due to estrogenic stimulation, which is normal. This is a normal scenario. A normal increase in hormones during pregnancy will lead to hypertrophy of the smooth muscle cells of the uterus and hyperplasia. This is the normal appearance of the smooth muscle cells, spindle in shape, and this is the hypertrophied smooth muscle cells and during pregnancy. Now again, remember that this is reversible. So after pregnancy, when estrogen goes back to normal, these enlarged muscles will return back to normal size, and the newly formed muscles, like in hyperplasia, will disappear. The uterus will go back to normal. And this is the other physiologic type of hypertrophy that I already told you about in athletes. Here, the skeletal muscles are inactive in patients in persons who are bodybuilders or athletes. It is enlarged. We call it skeletal muscle hypertrophy, and this is completely physiologic phenomena. The second adaptive mechanism is called hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is defined as increase in the number of cells with a correspondent increase in the size of the organ. The tissues that can undergo hyperplasia are the tissues that have the ability to divide. So, for example, the skeletal muscles, cardiac muscles, they do not have any ability to divide, so they can only undergo hypertrophy. Again, hyperplasia can be pure hyperplasia and can be mixed with hypertrophy according to the stimulus. It can be divided into physiologic forms and pathologic forms, like all adaptive mechanisms. The physiologic hyperplasia can be due to hormonal stimulation or compensatory hyperplasia. We will give examples in the next slides. And pathologic hyperplasia, which can be due to excessive hormonal stimulation or due to viral infections. Pathologic hyperplasia can constitute a fertile soil in which cancers may eventually arise, like, for example, the endometrial hyperplasia, which is driven by, which is caused by continuous estrogenic stimulation. Mostly, it affects females in the post-menopausal age. Continuous estrogenic stimulation in these females can lead to endometrial hyperplasia. If this endometrial hyperplasia persists or not treated, it can transform at some point into the endometrial carcinoma. So as an examples on physiologic and pathologic hyperplasia, the physiologic one is breast hyperplasia of the breast glands, glandular tissue, during puberty and during pregnancy in preparation to lactation. And compensatory hyperplasia of the liver after partial resection of the liver. For example, sometimes the part of the liver is removed, as in cases of trauma and hepatic tumors. The remaining cells of the liver, they will produce some growth factors that will stimulate the proliferation of hepatocytes to retain the normal pre-resection size of the liver. This is a peculiar ability of the liver cells to restore the normal size of the liver. Pathologic hyperplasia, like endometrial hyperplasia due to estrogenic stimulation, which I already told you about, especially in females in the postmenopausal age group. It can also result even in premenopausal women due to estrogenic stimulation. إذا البيشنت عندها, for example, any cause that lead to hyperestrogenic states. In males, the prostate gland in elderly males can undergo also hyperplasia. We call it benign prostatic hyperplasia. It is a disease process driven by androgenic stimulation or hyperandrogenic states. Leads to enlargement of the prostatic gland and urinary output obstruction. So it is a disease process. And viral infections also can lead to hyperplastic squamous epithelium, like in viral warts, which are caused by the human papilloma virus. These warts اللي هي التوليل اللي موجودة على السكن, it represents a pathologic form of hyperplasia. So this is the physiologic hyperplasia of the breast during puberty and during pregnancy and lactation. Look at the number of glands here and look at the number of glands here. There is an increase in the number of glands. This is called physiologic hyperplasia. Again, this is reversible. So when the pregnancy is comes to the end, or when the patient stops lactation, everything will go back to normal. And here you can find this is the uterus, and it is transected from the middle. You can see here the endometrial lining of the uterus. It is hyperplastic. This is called endometrial hyperplasia, and it is usually induced by continuous estrogenic stimulation. This is considered pathologic, and if it is not treated, it will transform to cancer. Now, the third adaptive mechanism is called atrophy. Atrophy means decrease in the cell size with a corresponding decrease in cell function. So the cells are still viable. They are not dead, but they function at the minimum. The mechanisms of cell atrophy are either decrease protein synthesis or increase protein degradation, or both of them, or increase in autophagy, in which the starved cell or the newly adaptive cell will eat its own organelles to generate energy. زي كأنها بتاكل نفسها، بتعمل autophagic vacuoles، والخلية بتاكل نفسها to generate energy. Now, the causes of atrophy are either decreased workload, for example, like when you immobilize a limb after a fracture. لما واحد يصير عنده كسر في العظم مثلا وحطوا ايده او رجله بالكاست اللي هي الجبيرة، راح يصير في عنا decreased workload on these muscles. So after you remove the cast, you will find that the muscle cells are decreased in size, and you will start the physiotherapy in order for these muscles to return back to normal size again. Also, loss of innervation when you cut a nerve, either by after trauma or after stab wounds, for example. This will lead to decrease innervation of the corresponding muscles or tissues with correspondent atrophy. Diminished blood supply as in ischemia, for example, like patients بيكون عندهم ischemia to the lower limbs, for example. الناس اللي عندهم تصلب شرايين، بقل تدفق الدم للأطراف السفلية من جسمهم للرجلين، ممكن تطلعوا على السكن بتكون very atrophic skin. But this is due to ischemia. Inadequate nutrition also, loss of endocrine stimulation. This is very important. Loss of endocrine or hormonal stimulation. It can be physiologic sometimes, or it can be pathologic. It can be physiologic, for example, as in patients after menopause, when we have normally decreased levels of estrogen in the blood, so they will develop endometrial atrophy. This is a physiologic phenomena. Senile atrophy also, which is due to aging, as you can see here in the brain of an aged person, in which the gyri are shrunken and the sulci are increased in size. This can be seen in senile atrophy, as well as other causes of brain atrophy like ischemia, for example. And here you can see the atrophy of the muscle cells after, for example, denervation or after immobilization. So atrophy can be physiologic and can be pathologic. As I said, it can be physiologic and can be pathologic. The best example on physiologic atrophy is the loss of hormonal stimulation after menopause. That's after the age of 50, usually due to the normal decrease in estrogen levels in the blood with correspondent endometrial atrophy. Pathologic atrophy can be due to denervation injury, for example, or chronic ischemia, like the skin of the lower limbs in patients اللي عندهم تصلب شرايين أو diabetics، وبقل ال blood supply to the lower limbs. If you look at their skin, you will find it atrophic, for example. Now, the last adaptive mechanism is called metaplasia. Metaplasia is considered a change from one cell type to another. Again, it's reversible, but we have a reprogramming of the stem cells to transform to give us a new type of cells. So metaplasia is not a transformation of the differentiated cells. It is at the level of the stem cells. Like if you, for example, if you look here, to the lining of the bronchial epithelium, we have these cells are called the stem cells. These stem cells هم الprogenitor cells. They give rise to the lining epithelium of the bronchus. Normally, they give us this ciliated pseudostratified respiratory epithelium. However, if this epithelium is exposed to stress or injurious stimuli, most importantly, the smoking, it will transform these stem cells to give rise to squamous cells instead of respiratory epithelial cells. And these squamous cells will cope better with the stress. However, they will function less. يعني هم بيعطوا حماية أكبر من السموكينج، لكن الفانكشنال ابيليتي تبعيتهم من تنقية الهواء نتيجة وجود السيليا من الميوكس برودكشن هاي كلياتها بتقل. So metaplasia is a change from one cell type to another that happens at the level of the stem cells, not the differentiated cells. And this new type of cells will cope better with the stress, but it comes at a functional loss. So the function will be different. The normal function is lost. Again, this is reversible. يعني when the patient stops smoking, the stem cells will switch again to the normal type of cell. However, if this persistent change continues due to continuous smoking, it will increase the risk of carcinoma development of the lung. And that's why smokers have a much higher chance of development of lung cancer, especially the squamous cell carcinoma, which is due to squamous metaplasia. The causes of metaplasia are smoking, like in this example, and gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. Those patients اللي عندهم reflux اللي هو الارتداد المريئي, the normal lining of the esophagus is the squamous epithelium, لكن لما البيشنت صار في عنده continuous reflux of gastric acidic content to the lower part of the esophagus, هذا السكويموس epithelium بيتبدل بنوع ثاني من الابيثيليوم بيكون glandular epithelium, وهذا بنسميه metaplasia. This glandular epithelium بيتحمل الأسيديتي of gastric juices أكتر، ولكن حمايته للإسوفيجاس بتكون أقل، وبرضه ممكن يزيد الريسك for the development of esophageal carcinoma. فهاي هي أهمية الميتابلازيا، إنها ممكن تتحول at some point إلى carcinoma. Another cause of metaplasia is vitamin A deficiency. Now, after we discussed the adaptations, we move to the other topic, which is cell injury and death. We have so many causes of cell injury. First one is oxygen deprivation, which we call it hypoxia. As you know, the hypoxia is different from ischemia. Ischemia is loss of blood supply, which can lead to hypoxia, بينما hypoxia is just loss of oxygen supply, which can be caused by ischemia or other causes like, for example, respiratory diseases. Chemical agents, infectious agents, immunologic reactions, genetic factors, nutritional imbalances, physical agents, and aging. So first of all, oxygen deprivation, which can be caused by ischemia. As I said to you, ischemia mostly is the result of occlusion of an artery by a thrombus or a blood clot. If it happens in the cerebral vessels, it can lead to stroke. Oxygen deprivation to the brain. If it happens in the heart, for example, it can give rise to myocardial infarction, جلطة القلبية. The main mechanism of ischemia in causing cell injury is the lack of blood supply, which leads to lack of oxygen supply. And as you know, oxygen is needed by all cells in their metabolism and for their energy production. So if there is no oxygen, the cell will enter into cell injury. Now, other causes of oxygen deprivation, for example, like pulmonary diseases, الناس اللي عندهم مشاكل pulmonary hypertension, pulmonary emphysema, for example, obstructive pulmonary diseases, all of these will lead to decrease in oxygen concentration in the blood, وبالتالي decrease في الأكسجين supply للtissues. Now, chemical agents. Chemical agents are so many, like sugar is considered an injurious chemical agent. Patients اللي عندهم diabetes, salts, excessive salts, drugs, for example, pesticides, insecticides, all of these agents are chemicals that can cause cell injury and cell death. Infectious agents starting from viruses like herpes viruses, coronavirus, hepatitis C virus, influenza viruses, all of these viruses can injure tissues, also bacteria, protozoa, parasites, worms, all of these can lead to cell injury. Immunologic reactions also can lead to cell injury, whether they are autoimmune diseases اللي هي أمراض المناعة ضد الذات, or that are allergic conditions زي أمراض الحساسية, rhinitis, conjunctivitis, eczema, for example, as you see here in the picture. Microbes also can induce an immunologic reaction to their antigens. All of these can result in cell injury. Genetic factors also can cause cell injury, starting from the chromosomal abnormalities, like in Down syndrome, for example, leading to abnormal or associated with certain disease processes, ending with the single gene defects, which can lead to, for example, enzymatic deficiency or abnormal enzymatic activity, leading to different disease processes. Like certain types of anemia, for example, and other conditions. Nutritional imbalances also can lead to cell injury, whether from undernutrition or malnutrition, for example, not getting enough of certain types of food, proteins, carbs, or vitamins, for example, the vitamin deficiencies, ending with the nutritional excess, like obesity and its associated diseases. Physical agents like trauma, extremes of temperatures, electric shock, for example, all of these also can result in injury. So these are the causes of cell injury. Now, in the next lectures, we will discuss the types of cell injury, which are the reversible and irreversible, in addition to the mechanisms by which cell injury occurs in the cells.